April 26th, 1986. The Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant, Pripyat, Ukraine. The Chernobyl nuclear disaster stands as perhaps one of the worst disasters to ever happen to mankind. The environmental repercussions and the loss of life was catastrophic, and is something that many people hope never happens again in human history. However, in the days leading up to the disaster, stories would emerge from the staff at the Chernobyl nuclear plant of a strange, dark-colored creature with glowing red eyes stalking the skies and perimeter around the building. These stories and sightings would continue after the accident, prompting many to ask the question, what was this strange creature, and was it perhaps a precursor to the accident? Now, this creature that has come to be known as the Black Bird of Chernobyl is just one of many, many variations of the creature that is widely known and described as Mothman. While the stories have poured in from all around the globe, the consistency of descriptions given by eyewitnesses begs the question that it is possible that people from all around the world could be seeing the same thing, and that these are in fact not isolated instances, but rather perhaps one giant web of unexplained creatures possibly not recognized by science. Today on Unblurring the Unknown, the final episode into our 4-part series Into the Mothman, we travel around the globe and explore sightings and stories of other Mothman-related beings and try to see if it could be possible that these creatures are one and the same, or maybe just sheer coincidence. In addition to that, we will dive into my personal final thoughts and theories into the Mothman phenomenon. Today, we explore our final entry into this series of our special investigation into the Mothman with Episode 4, International Incidents. Welcome back to Unblurring the Unknown. As always, I am your host, Dominic, and if you are listening to this show on YouTube or Spotify, I first want to thank you for checking out the show. Feel free to follow me at both places, like, comment, subscribe. If you're on YouTube, it helps me out within the algorithm, and I greatly appreciate it. If you're checking me out on Spotify, please turn on post notifications so you get notified every time I post a new episode. And while you're at it, while we're talking about it, feel free to go ahead and follow me on Instagram and TikTok at the same handle, Unblurring the Unknown. Now, with that all the way, I do want to apologize before we dive into the very beginning of this episode. I'm just getting down from or coming off of a cold, I should say, so I sound a little bit phlegmy. So I just want to get that out of the way if I sound a bit stuffed up for this week's episode. But today on the show, we have the last entry into our Mothman series, and I first want to again, apologize for not publishing, or at least not being able to consistently publish episodes. I know I apologized about that in last week's episode. But yeah, it's just kind of been a hectic New Year's for me, kind of with a new schedule, new job for myself. So everything is kind of piecing it together, kind of what my new schedule looks like on a day-to-day basis. So again, I'm trying to develop a new habit, a new schedule for myself, and make sure that I am publishing as consistently as I possibly can. And again, as much as you already know, or perhaps if you were listening to this show for the very first time, this is just a one-man show. It is just myself. I do obviously all the recording, as you're hearing me now, all the research, all of graphic design, video editing. It's all done by me, and it's tough. You know, my schedule kind of changed on the fly there when I got the new job opportunity. So it's been a crazy couple of weeks, but again, I hope to become more consistent as I slowly try to figure my life outside of the workplace out, and things like that. However, with that all out of the way, let's talk about today's episode and what we are going to be covering. Now, like I mentioned, if this happened to be the first time that you were listening to this show or checking me out for the very first time, I highly encourage you are late to the party. This is episode 4, so feel free to go all the way back to episode 1 into this 4-part series into the Mothman, and I will dive into every nitty-gritty detail with you through episodes 1, 2, and 3 that we've covered so far. Now, I hope all of you who are tuning into this episode have already listened to the first 3 entries into this series, so a lot of this stuff I won't have to rehash with you. But if this is the first time, please pause this podcast wherever you are right now, and then go all the way back and start at episode 1 and listen all the way through, and then come back and join me here. Now, with that out of the way, I wanted to take an episode, that being this episode, and talk about other stories and accounts coming in from other parts of the world of creatures and beings that bear a striking resemblance to the myth and legend in question, that being the Mothman. Now, I feel like those sightings are imperative to the overall legend, and perhaps putting the pieces together of the overall legend of the Mothman itself. You have stories from numerous different countries all over the world, not just the United States, and what happened in Point Pleasant, and what happened in Chicago in more recent times, but all over the world. People have claimed to see creatures that are pretty much the Mothman, and I think that there could be a broader reason for that. However, the very first story I want to talk about when it comes to these other sister creatures, if you will, and stories of the Mothman, would be perhaps one of the more famous versions of an international incident regarding a creature that bears a striking resemblance to that of the Mothman, and that being a group of sightings reported from the nuclear fallout of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine. Now, the Black Bird of Chernobyl, as the creature has come to be known, exists perhaps more within the realm of legend than perhaps truth. Now, while the story of what happened at Chernobyl is widely known, the initial stories of people seeing something they could not explain widely seems to have come from the mid-2000s as opposed to 1986, when the nuclear accident took place. However, these stories, from what I was able to find, seem to start in the days and weeks leading up to the accident on April 26, 1986. In early 1986, site managers at the Chernobyl plant would start to receive reports from employees. Many employees would report seeing an unidentified shadowy figure from behind the fences of the nuclear plant. Most of these sightings were disregarded until one night a female employee came running into the security office in a panic and screaming, stating that she had seen a strange creature near one of the parking lots of the plant. She explained to security guards on duty that she had been walking out to her car when she heard the rustling of trees and bushes nearby. She would see a pair of glowing red eyes in the branches of the trees seemingly sitting there, cutting through the dark light like razor blades. This creature would make a hissing noise towards the woman and take off from the tree with enormous wings that it had behind it. After this sighting, others would begin to report more sightings with this strange creature. 2 caretakers who were coming in for their morning shift would state they would see a large black winged creature flying above the power plant in the morning. It made a shriek-like noise and would fly off into the distance. Another worker would have a run-in on his way home at night when he would have to swerve his car out of the way to avoid a creature that had swerved down and dived down in front of his car as he was heading home that night. A significant number of workers would come forward and start feeling sick or claiming that they were feeling sick at work or had to go home because they were feeling unwell. These would often go hand in hand with those who had some sort of sightings, and others stated at the plant that they would be having nightmares of a dark winged figure with glowing red eyes. However, the upper management of the plant did not take these sightings seriously. Many openly discussing the creature were threatened with suspension, and those who went home sick would be called by the plant telling them to return to work. And overall, they told their employees to stop spreading rumors of this strange creature of the night that was stalking the perimeter and skies of the plant. Now, according to this story, according to this legend, some of the callers calling the staff who called out sick would say that they were from the KGB and military intelligence. Now, whether or not this is the case seems to be unconfirmed. Now, according to lore, the idea of the creature's presence around the facility seems to be a precursor to the explosion at the number 4 reactor of the Chernobyl plant. However, according to the story, there was a sighting that took place shortly after the accident as well. Now, in one source that I found, a Russian military flight engineer by the name of Valery Semyonov was pouring chemicals, dirt, and clay and sand onto the fires of the reactor in an effort to put it out. And he would, of course, be in a Russian military helicopter, or a plane. Helicopter or plane. He was in the sky, needless to say. The plane he was in would suddenly veer off course while he was inside. It would sending him crashing into the side of the plane and the pallets of supplies that were within the plane. Now, Semyonov would compose himself and make sure that he wasn't hurt, before investigating what happened that caused the plane to kind of suddenly veer like that. When arriving at the cockpit, he would hear the sounds of panic and commotion, and when opening the door, he would be greeted by the pilots pointing at a dark shape that was seemingly darting in between the clouds of smoke gathered in the air from the fires from the nuclear power plant. Semyonov would see the outline of a black figure with wings and glowing red eyes. Now, the official explanation from the Soviet government would be that what the people were seeing were actually something called a black stork, which is a large endangered bird, roughly 3 feet tall. However, here comes the doubt when it comes to the Black Bird of Chernobyl story. Many cryptozoologists have come forward and seemingly debunked the idea of the Black Bird of Chernobyl legend, stating that the legend was completely fabricated. Loren Coleman, an infamous cryptozoologist who served as an advisor on the Mothman Prophecies movie, stated that there was no documented proof of any sightings around the Chernobyl nuclear plant leading up to or after the accident, and that this was a misconception to the overall Mothman legend. As it turns out, the story of the Black Bird of Chernobyl was shared within the Mothman Prophecies movie in conjunction with another supposed sighting of the Mothman in Galveston, Texas, before one of their deadly earthquakes. On the blog Cryptomundo in 2008, Coleman would write the following: "This is poor myth-making. The famed big hurricanes in Galveston occurred in 1900 and 1915, long before the Houston Batman was seen in 1953. The movie also tries to link Chernobyl's nuclear meltdown with precursor sightings of the Mothman. Not true. There were no sightings. It was all made up for the movie. Time to move on from these fictionalized additions to the Mothman story that keep distracting researchers from any real investigations of the Point Pleasant phenomena, whatever that might be." Now, this sentiment would also be shared by another researcher named Micah Hanks in 2012, who called the Black Bird of Chernobyl a misconception within the Mothman subgenre. According to Tobias Wayland, who we talked about his work extensively on the last episode, in his 2019 book, he would state that to date, the only concrete evidence that we have of Mothman showing up before an accident would be before the Silver Bridge disaster in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. He would also agree with Loren Coleman's sentiments as well and state that any other claims of sightings before major disasters would be taken from fictional sources. Now, while the Black Bird of Chernobyl, while one of the more popular Mothman stories, is more than likely debunked, I want to move on to another story, and that being of the Owl Man. Now, the Owl Man is another one of these creatures that is widely speculated to be perhaps a hoax, perhaps even more of a cut and dry hoax compared to that of the kind of drama that has surrounded the story of the Black Bird of Chernobyl. However, while it is regarded to possibly be a hoax, it doesn't seem from what I was able to find whether or not it is a bona fide hoax or not, or seemingly something that has been debunked or disproven or anything like that. There just seems to be a lot of opinions out there that say that this story and this sequence of events more than likely was fabricated in some degree. However, it is not known for fact whether or not it is or isn't. Now, the Owl Man, also called the Cornish Owl Man or the Owl Man of Mannan, was first reported on April 17, 1976, and was first sighted by June and Vicky Melling, who, along with their parents, were on a family vacation in Mannan, Cornwall, in the United Kingdom. Now, as the story goes, while the Melling family was on vacation, June and Vicky would be near the St. Mannan and St. Stephen's Church and state that they would see a large winged creature hovering above the church tower. According to the story, the girls were terrified at seeing this large bird man creature thing, that they would return to their parents in a sheer panic, and their father actually decided to cut their family vacation short because of this sighting by the girls. Now, the sighting would be investigated and reported on by a man named Tony, aka Doc, Shields. Now, Shields would claim that one of the girls would draw a picture of this creature and give it to him, which he dubbed the Owl Man. Now, this initial report would be circulated around in pamphlets in Cornwall in 1976, and supposedly would not be the only sighting of the Owl Man, according to Shields. Now, supposedly another sighting would take place in July 3rd of 1976, when another two young girls, Barbara Perry and Sally Chapman, would state that they would see a very large owl with pointed ears and being the size of a man with pincer-like claws. Now, supposedly some more sightings would come in the years that followed, Sightings around the vicinity of the church would be reported supposedly in 1978, 79, 89, and 1995. Now, whether or not you believe that the Owlman could be real, two theories have been proposed. The first being that the Owlman is what it was in the beginning of his name, an owl. Essentially, a Eurasian eagle owl, as the primary theory that is proposed when you talk about the Owlman being an animal, or something very much conventionally explained. Now, the Eurasian eagle owl, also known as just a Eurasian owl or eagle owl, is a very, very large bird with a wingspan of over 6 feet long and the bird standing a little bit over 2 feet tall. This would make it a very, very large owl. And of course, owls love little reclusive spaces where they can hide and build their nests, making the towers of churches a perfect spot for them if they decide to call that home. They have very large beady eyes and tufts right above their ears, giving them an impression of having horns when they really don't. I can see why there could be a misidentification of some sort, especially when it comes to children reporting a sighting and then circulating these sightings all throughout the town of Cornwall. If it was in fact a very large owl that was living within the church tower, it would make sense why those would claim that they would see a creature, when in fact it was just a large owl. Now, the next theory that has been proposed is that this story of the Owlman was a hoax fabricated by Tony Doc Shields. Now, historian Gareth Medway claims that this entire thing could have been a hoax fabricated by Shields. He states that it seemingly has to be more than just a coincidence that Shields was the focal point of this entire story, who has had a little bit of a history exaggerating his stories and claims. Medway states the following, and I quote, "Were either Doc Shields or friends of Doc Shields or relatives of Doc Shields or reported their sightings to Doc Shields and to no one else, or else wrote letters describing what they had seen to newspapers and were never interviewed by anyone." Now, this kind of comes in context as Medway was explaining that pretty much the sightings of the Owlman were flowing directly through Doc Shields. They were not flowing through anybody else. They weren't being reported to newspapers. They were pretty much all of this information was seemingly going through Doc Shields. And pretty much what Medway is stating is that, again, nobody had been interviewed subsequently after these claims were made by Shields, who made them on behalf of other eyewitnesses. And Medway would seemingly make these claims in an article in Magonia magazine in 2017. Now, I feel like I share a much similar opinion to that of Medway. This seems like all of these sightings, if not all, at least a majority of them, seem to have come from the mouth of Doc Shields, and Medway makes a very good point. This would also take place in 1976, so pretty much a decade removed from the initial sightings of the Mothman creature in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. So in my opinion, it wouldn't be too outlandish to think that seeing an article somewhere of the 10th year anniversary of the sightings of the Mothman could have been enough to spur the desire to make up a sighting and keep the ruse going. Whether or not the Owlman is more than just a story seems unlikely. If it was a creature, I am leaning towards the possibility of this being a very, very large eagle owl, and this would connect the dots well enough, and then you would take a pretty well-known exaggerator, according to Medway, in Doc Shields, and suddenly you have a much bigger story than initially on the surface it presents itself as. Unfortunately, that is what I think happened here. Now, the next story I want to share with you when it comes to kind of international renditions of the Mothman is one of the more compelling stories that I'm going to share with you, and that kind of comes out of this group of Mothman-like encounters that people have had in other countries, and we're going to stay in England again for this one. So let's talk about the story and sightings of the Bat Beast of Kent. Now, our story begins on November 16th, 1963, so please keep that date in mind, as that means that this story would take place 3 years before the first Mothman sighting in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Four young teenagers, 17-year-old John Flaxton and 18-year-old Mervyn, I think I'm pronouncing it right, Mervyn Hutchinson, as well as 17-year-old Tony Harrison and 16-year-old Jenny Holloway, were all walking home one night after attending a local party in the county of Kent in southeast England. As the initial report states, they were walking along Sandling Road towards the local Sandling railway station. The goal of this was for Jenny to catch a train home, and since Jenny at the time was the girlfriend of John John had to make sure that she got to the train safely that night. Now, along the road to the train station, the landscape around them was mostly just a school building and open fields. Now, as a group of teens made their way down the road, something caught their attention in the night sky. UFO investigator Charles Stickland, who would launch an investigation into this entire encounter, would write in the London UFO Research Organization Bulletin in 1963 the following, and I quote, "While they were passing Brock Hill School, they saw what appeared to be a shooting star fall towards the Sandling Station area. A little later, they had just passed Slaybrook Corner, a right-angle bend, when a glowing object was seen above a hill on the left. No light was projected from it, and it did not move. It was slightly oval, but more round than oval. The light was lost sight of behind trees as they walked down a dip in the road. While descending this incline, a figure was seen about 20 to 30 yards away on the road ahead on the right-hand side." Now, before we move on to this figure that the kids saw, I want to talk a little bit about this light that they observed in the sky. This object that the teens said that they saw, they described it as a reddish-yellow orb a few meters in diameter. This light that they saw in the sky descended into the woods of Sandling Park, and this object was enough to pique the interest of the teens, who decided to try and get a closer look at whatever this unexplained light was. They made their way towards the edge of the park, however, they could not see any more of this strange orb. However, this would be when the teens would see something they couldn't explain even more than this strange yellow reddish orb. They would all state that they would observe a strange 5-foot-tall black figure emerge from the brush and tree line nearby. This creature was described as particularly odd. It was covered in thick black fur, had a pair of wings behind its back that were described much like a bat's wings, and had webbed feet and almost waddled as it walked. Perhaps the strangest of all was that the teens said that it appeared like the creature did not have a head, almost like it stopped right where there was supposed to be a head, which again is very, very strange, and is something that is truly unique to this sighting and not any other sightings of the Mothman that I've been able to find. Now, the creature being described as almost making a waddling motion while it walked is something that has been observed before. Back in episode 1, we talked about the sighting that the Scarberries and Mallets would have in Point Pleasant in 1966, where they described their figure as almost waddling during their sighting when it tried to walk. They seemed to observe the creature or the kids that is, they have seemed to observe this creature for an unknown amount of time until they decided to get the heck out of Dodge. From that point on, it is believed the teenagers brought Jenny to the local station, and the three teenage boys would later be seen in a pub after the sighting and be described as, and I quote, "3 of the boys came into the pub after seeing the ghost. They were white as sheets. It was no joke," according to the Kent Messenger in 1963. Now, initial reports cropped up the sightings to something paranormal in nature, and that the creature was actually a ghost from the 1900s. However, that seems very much against what the witnesses state they saw. The police would investigate this initial report from the teenagers. However, they did not really take it all too seriously and chalked it up to perhaps a misidentification or overactive imaginations. However, this is in fact not where the story ends. On November 21st, 1963, a man named Keith Croucher would come forward and state that he would have a UFO encounter over a local soccer field not too far away from where the teenagers had their sighting with the strange orb and the weird headless bat penguin. I'm going to laugh because I remember writing that down in the script for this episode, and I thought that was pretty funny, and that was the best way I could describe this little creature, is the weird headless bat penguin. Now, this seemingly would be the first piece of evidence to corroborate what the teens might have seen that could have in fact been real. Then, 2 days later, on November 23rd, a local man named John McGoldrick was fascinated by the stories coming out of Sandling Park in Kent over the Bat Beast and these sightings of UFOs, so he decided that he wanted to go out there and see what he could find. McGoldrick and a friend of his ventured out into Sandling Park, and what they would find would add more evidence to the belief that what the teenagers saw that night was legit. McGoldrick and his friend would discover a set of mysterious footprints within the woods that measured 24 inches in length and 9 inches across, much larger than any conventional animal. In addition to this, McGoldrick would find a large patch of flattened grass and brush, comparable to that if a very large person or object had trampled over it again and again, until it was fully flattened out. Now, McGoldrick would take his findings back into town and eventually stir up some journalists to head back out to the site in early December of 1963. However, they would not find anything additional when McGoldrick would bring out all of these journalists. Now, the story itself would generate significant buzz in the media at the time. However, the story itself has stood the test of time, with many offering theories about what could be responsible. Unlike the previous two creatures we covered, the Bat Beast of Kent stands out as a possible legit suspect in the Mothman enigma and could be a genuine relative of what we have seen here in North America. Now, in addition to this, as we're going to keep on this train of talking about kind of Mothman relatives, there have been sightings and rumors from Japan that the Mothman was sighted in and around the Fukushima power plant in Japan, leading up to the Fukushima nuclear accident in the massive 9.0 earthquake that would rock Japan in March of 2011. Now, I did find two separate stories of these sightings, one near Fukushima in February of 2011, and then one actually happening in Kyoto, Japan in April of that year, which would of course be after the earthquake and accident. Now, in regards to these sightings and in regards to kind of the Mothman being sighted around the Fukushima nuclear plant, I want to take a conservative approach on this and speak on this kind of like the Black Bird we spoke about a little bit earlier. I did not find many reports on these supposed sightings, and there is actually a photo of what was sighted in Kyoto. However, it is impossible to figure out what you were truly looking at. It is taken at such a distance away, the picture is very blurry, and you don't really know what you're looking at. I also think that the natural human assumption of the Mothman is to try and package it together with some type of disaster because of what happened in Point Pleasant. However, like Lauren Coleman stated back in 2008, and Tobias Whalen stating just recently, the only thing we know that happened and was documented when it came to the Mothman appearing before disasters would be what took place in Point Pleasant. Now again, there is another story I want to share with you all, and it kind of exists again in this threshold of kind of more mythology and lore and legend rather than fact. And this story seems to come out of Germany when it comes to a Mothman-like figure. Again, like I mentioned, this story actually seems more legend, folklore, and we only have one single account and one single story to go along with this creature. This creature, known as the Freiburg Schrecker, which would translate to Freiburg Scarer in English, Freiburg being the town in which this sighting would take place. Now, according to folklore, on September 10th, 1978, a group of miners getting ready to descend into a mine in Freiburg, Germany, when a massive black-winged creature with large wings would fly down and drop in front of the mine entrance. It would spread out its wings and block the entrance, preventing the miners from entering the mine, and it would let out an inhuman screech. The miners would wait for some time for this creature to leave, however, it wouldn't, and according to this story, the creature in a sense prevented the death of all the miners, as an explosion would reportedly happen in the mine shaft and it would catch on fire, rendering it unusable, and ultimately this would have killed all of the miners if they were inside of the mine during this explosion. However, there are wrinkles within this Freiburg Schrecker story. By all accounts, I was not able to find, or anybody else for that matter that I was able to find online, and in all the sources I checked, there was no mine explosion reported on the day this creature was sighted in Freiburg, Germany, and there was very little evidence to support the fact that this story was even real, as I couldn't find anything additional in my personal research about the Freiburg Schrecker, other than like two very little snippets about what I just shared with you. Now, I believe that the majority of Mothman-related international encounters that I were able to find kind of left me disappointed. And this is kind of where I'm going to summarize the episode in totality here. Now, before I had done this deep dive and research, I had assumed that there were a lot more credible sightings and evidence, leading me to believe that the Mothman was a global phenomenon. However, I'm hesitant to believe that is the case, which is unfortunate, because I want to believe the idea that this is some kind of broad, overarching concept with a vast amount of genuine sightings and stories that can be verified. However, that seems to not be the case. However, we've discussed a slew of these kind of international cases of these Mothman-adjacent creatures, and I am sure that there is a couple bits and pieces that I have left out of the story. I know back in the Cryptomundo post that Lauren Coleman shared in 2008, he mentioned the Houston Batman. That is another Mothman-like creature. I actually covered that back in the episode into one of the Cryptids Across America episodes when we did Texas. I talked about the Houston Batman, and that's another Mothman adjacent creature. But again, that story itself is also widely debated, kind of widely discussed that possibly could be a hoax as well. So there is not a whole lot. We have all of these stories and all of these legends and all of these tales of these creatures that bear a lot of resemblance to that of the Mothman as we know it. However, there's not a lot of evidence to back them up. And those of you who have been listening to my show for a very long time know that I like to take probably more of a conservative approach when it comes to some things. Not everything, but I like to think that there needs to be some type of evidence to support something, unless, all of our bases are already covered, and then maybe I get a little more outlandish with my takes. But overall, I had heard all of these stories about Mothman kind of adjacent creatures and monsters that have been reported from all over the globe. And of course, at the time, I've heard these things in my research and things like that when I'm doing other episodes or whatever it may be. I had never done a deep dive into these things, and once I finally was able to, I was kind of left myself disappointed that there was not much evidence to support these creatures' existence, and that most likely they were fabricated, with the exception, of course, of the Bat Beast of Kent, which seems, by all of my research, seems to be genuine. But like I said, I'm sure there is a few that I might have missed, or some that I might have left out in my research, some very little side nuggets of the Mothman. And again, I tried my best to chronicle all of the information I possibly can over this 4-episode series. But if there was ever something that I omitted, that I didn't realize I did, feel free to let me know down in the comments section. Feel free to let me know if I happen to miss something. I'm usually good about getting back to my comments. I actually got to go through probably a couple of them, get back to maybe a few people who've left me comments in the past. But if I happen to miss something in this episode, feel free to leave me down in a comment, and I will absolutely take a look at it. Again, I'm just one guy, so sometimes I get a little time constraint, but I try to get everything that I possibly can. However, now that we have discussed these international sightings, that brings us ultimately to this penultimate idea of this series, and that being discussing the theories and my own personal thoughts about the Mothman. Now, with that being said, let's discuss the major theories about what the Mothman could be. Now, the first theory is cryptid, and of course, this first theory is possibly one of the widely discussed theories, if not the most discussed theory, when it comes to the Mothman. And of course, there are quite a few of these theories, but perhaps this is what we often associate the Mothman with, more times than not. We associate him or her or it with something along the lines of the cryptid realm, this mysterious creature that exists within the same category as Bigfoot in the Loch Ness Monster. And after doing all of this research, I don't know if I truly feel that way. Before doing all of this research, I didn't realize how much the Mothman lived on that edge of aliens and extraterrestrials rather than cryptid. Now, while I believe that the Mothman itself could be some type of unchronicled creature unknown to science, I don't think it is in the traditional sense. Let's just say that. Now, the second theory is alien, in that this would be that the Mothman is some type of alien being that was here on Earth, or still currently is, for some unknown purpose. Now, again, while parts of this story I like, or other parts of this theory, that I like, other parts I am not nearly as convinced. While I do think there could be a potential tie-in as to why sightings of the Mothman seem to coincide with sightings of UFO and extraterrestrial activity, I am not so sure if the Mothman itself is an alien, or rather some type of interdimensional entity, much like John Keel thought it was. Perhaps it is an alien in a sense, but not like the little green and gray men that we like to often think of when we talk about aliens and UFOs. I've investigated plenty of cases where aliens do not take one of the more traditional shapes and forms we are normally accustomed to, and while I like the idea that the Mothman could be some type of creature that escaped from alien captivity and thus was actively hunted down in Point Pleasant back in 1966, however, that does not account for the other stories, and especially what has been cited in Chicago now in recent times. So overall, there are some holes in the overall alien theory. Now, the last theory I want to go over with you is the interdimensional slip theory, and this is a theory or a kind of a theory proposed by John Keel in Point Pleasant that the Mothman and this increase of activity, both UFO related and supernatural, that seems to accompany the Mothman could be some type of interdimensional slip where supernatural activity takes place more frequently than in other parts of the world. Now, that might seem kind of hard to wrap your brain around. However, we have examples of this, or what we think we have examples of this. Areas of the world often deemed these quote-unquote triangles where people go missing, people encounter strange creatures, and even UFOs and aliens. Could this be what this is, and merely the Mothman is one form of a creature that can appear throughout these interdimensional slips? We, of course, covered on this show in the past the Bridgewater Triangle, and that is over in Bridgewater, Massachusetts, and kind of the surrounding area. And we covered that episode very early in this show's history, and we explored the kind of haunting cloud of activity that seems to permeate that area. Sightings of monsters like Bigfoot and even mythical tiny people known as puckwudgies are said to exist in this area, and many have stated that this area is where people go missing. People see things that they cannot explain, are because of these places perhaps being gateways to other dimensions or places within our space-time that cross over and bleed into our world. Now, to me, albeit very far-fetched, this seems to be the only thing that would account for all of the activity that takes place seemingly simultaneously. You have a winged humanoid creature that defies conventional explanation. You have numerous UFO sightings and supernatural activity. You have the sightings of Indrid Cold, the grinning man, and that being humanoid alien-like beings in the case of Indrid Cold. And the idea that this is some type of interdimensional gateway or a slip within space-time seems to be the only thing, albeit, like I said, very far-fetched, that would account for all of this activity. Now, with that all being said, that might be a lot for you to wrap your brain around. The possibility of an interdimensional gateways where all sorts of things can manage to slip through, perhaps that, even in of itself, might be an episode to cover in the future, or an idea for an episode to cover in the future. Now, overall, I myself have thoroughly enjoyed this deep dive into all things Mothman, and while I have found myself slightly disappointed that this legend has mostly kept itself in the United States, with some few exceptions, human creativity and the lust for fame and myth has created these offshoots of this story, and I think that stands as significant for the Mothman's impact on humans as a people. These creatures that have seemingly taken on a life of their own within pop culture and within the media and social circles often causes us to take a closer look at what is real and what is fiction. But there's often a shred of truth in everything that we see. Well, maybe not everything, but I'd like to think a majority of everything. I think the Mothman legend is real, and one that has solidified itself as a modern-day legend, and rightfully so. Whether or not you want to believe the Mothman is some type of monster or alien or interdimensional figure like I personally think it has stood the test of time, and the sheer amount of documentation of legit sightings between Point Pleasant and Chicago makes the creature stand out as perhaps one of the more compelling cryptids that exist today. While the answer might not be as cut and dry as you think, the story of the Mothman transcends people, legend, pop culture, and society, and has been given the developments in Chicago back less than 5 years ago. I doubt that this is the last chapter that would be entered into the story of the Mothman. But I guess for now, we wait. We wait until the next person sees those glowing red eyes, or the presence of some otherworldly force coming from the skies. But until then, we have the stories to keep us company, and we might never know where the Mothman might turn up next. But with that being said, that is going to do it for me. This week's episode of Unblurring the Unknown, and the final episode into our 4-part series into the Mothman. As I opened this series, this was something that was very fun for me to research, and albeit I should have stayed more consistent with getting these episodes up for you all, I can't say it enough how much fun this sequence of episodes was, doing all the research, doing all the legwork into this, and kind of presenting this all in a format where I was able to try and chronicle all of the information that I possibly could have had available to me. Now, again, I am just a one-man band. Sometimes I do miss things, and I do apologize if I did at any point, but I tried to summarize everything the best that I could and present this in a format that was different, that was exciting, and that's something that everybody could kind of be excited for, that was released on a week-by-week basis, and not something where you kind of caught me talking for 2 to 3 hours on end. Obviously, this being the second version of kind of these longer formatted episodes that I've done, the special investigation series, I do thoroughly enjoy them, and often I find myself, if there's a topic that has a lot of kind of meat to it, like the Mothman or so on and so forth, that I need to do it justice by doing kind of more than a 30-minute traditional episode that you usually see me post. Now, the very first version of the special investigation episodes I did was all the way back during the Mr. Cruel episode, I should say, and you caught me talking for almost 3 hours on end, and that is an excruciating long time to be sitting for a podcast. I know some people actually like listening to that. I know I had a former coworker of mine, and he was listening to basically a long-form history podcast where they're like 4 to 6 hours. And for me, that's too much, because I start talking 30, 45 minutes, an hour. My mouth is dry. My throat hurts. Like, I'm just being honest with you. So I can't only imagine, these 4-hour podcasts. And of course, they take breaks. But, that's an awfully long time to be talking to people, especially if you're just one person like me. I have to imagine once 30 minutes goes up, you're like, okay, I'm done with hearing this guy's voice for a whole week. I'll wait till next week, and then I'll get my fill, and then I'm good for another week. But with that being all said, I'm getting a little off track here. Again, I want to circle back and thank you again for all the support. If you like the show, and if you like everything that I'm doing here, and you like all things kind of paranormal, supernatural, unsolved, unexplained, true crime, cryptids, aliens, you name it, feel free to share this show with people you might think might be interested in this type of thing. Feel free to share it with your family, co-workers, everything of the nature. Feel free to share it with them. It helps get my name out there, and I greatly appreciate it. But again, with that all being said, that is going to do it for this 4-part series on the Mothman, this special investigation series, this being the last episode. I hope you all enjoyed this crazy little ride of episodes with me. I certainly did, and I will see you all on the very next episode, where we'll be doing something different for the first time in about 5 weeks. We're going to be doing a different topic. You're not going to hear me talk about the Mothman anymore. But again, with that being said, thank you for all the support. And I will see you all on the next one.